2 feet of water maybe. And it's not flowering at that point, but it seems to survive it. The unfortunate part is the county always seems to mow right about the time it's getting ready to bloom. But it survives in a right of way where it's mowed in a ditch. The only other thing I can add to that is we've got it at the Bailey homestead, but not doing well because the rabbits love it. They're eating it just straight to the ground.
You need more rabbit food out there.
I would think that this would be a good littoral plant.
Mm-hmm.
I would.
What do y'all think?
Have you tried this at all in your littoral demonstration area, Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, that's where we've got it, are places that are kind of damp. Okay. I don't think I would put it at the bottom of a bank, even though I just told you I saw it in the right of way, like under a couple feet of water. I think it's kind of ephemeral in that kind of situation. But if you have it towards the higher end of the bank, I think it would be fine. Or an area that just kind of sits in and is kind of mucky.
Cassie, do you have this at all? Or Nick?
We do have it. And like Jenny said, it's beautiful when it does bloom, but the flowers, they don't last very long. So most of the year you end up with the clumps of the green grass, which I think are still attractive, in itself. Like it might, replace some of those, what are they? Is it mondo grasses? I can't. Yeah. Okay. It could be a good replacement for that in areas that are consistently moist. I don't think it can handle drought. And then, you get that flush of flower for a very short period of time. But the grass itself is lovely. I think the grass is attractive, but I definitely don't think we should promote it for the inflorescence. The inflorescence should just be an added benefit, a little surprise and a little show, but definitely not something long lasting.
Okay. And where do you, how wet was the area that you have it?
So mine is maybe 10 feet up from the retention pond. So it's not wet, but I've realized recently that my yard tends to be a little bit more moist than average, just as I've played with planting different plants. Plants that tend to like more average to wet soil are happier in my yard. Whereas if I try to plant scrub plants, I think my yard and my soil type just holds too much moisture. Except in the area that you I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying this or not, but you refer to the health strip, the strip of grass that communities sometimes have in between the paved road and the sidewalk. Both yours and my communities have a health strip. I can plant scrub plants there, and I think it's just because it just bakes in the sun and it's so dry. So I would say average to wet moisture for the blue-eye grass.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that health strip area actually has a lot of gravel, some of the road base and stuff like that in it. And that's what makes it that way. A bit unfriendly. Okay. Well, I had hoped we'd have a few more people early. To do the officer vote for the annual meeting. So, but we don't. So should we do that, or should we just wait until after the meeting?
You want to wait till after the meeting, see if more people show up?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Okay. Um, yeah, I don't know where Christopher is. He wasn't at Cutting Horse today, but he's not usually there on Thursdays. Anyway, Jenny, if you want, you can grab the screen and we can get ready. I can introduce you, or Tony, did you want to introduce Jenny?
Well, you can introduce her, it's fine.
Okay. Tony's going to be our new president after we vote, after Jenny's talk. So we have about 6 minutes. So if anyone needs to take a break before we get going, now's a good time to do that.
I have a message in the middle of my screen that the meeting is being recorded.
Yes.
Can you delete that or somehow get rid of it?
Can you click OK? Is there an OK button? Did it work for you, Tony? Oh, we lost Tony.
You must have said no.
Yeah, it
Boosting
gives you two options, either continue, or if you refuse recording, you get kicked out. Here's Tony.
He won't do that again.
And Marlene, I stopped sharing my screen because my cursor tends to disappear if it stays
Oh,
too long. So I'm gonna wait
Okay.
until we're ready to go.
no problem.
But Tony's back. I see him.
I see him too. Looks like Paula's here. Hi, Paula. And Greg's here. Paula, how are you doing?
I'm fine. Had to
Good.
go on mute. Hello.
Hi.
Two of you are shy. Won't let you
Yeah, well,
be.
I worked all day and that's my
Yeah,
excuse.
yeah. How's everything out there?
Good. Things are looking really good. Sales have been crazy busy.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So that's all really nice. I just trying to keep plants in stock pretty much.
Do you need some peperomia?
We can always use peperomia. Do you have excess?
Oh yeah, I had to trim mine because it's very happy, and
Yeah.
I've got some of it is just rooting. It's not in a pot yet, but
Uh-huh.
some of it is just leaves that I shoved into pots, and I have several different options for you. I will bring them out to you one day.
Yeah, well, it looks like just a couple minutes here, but it looks like we're going to pick up a new project up in North Fort Myers, and it's going to be adjacent to the Powell Creek filter marsh. I'm going to go up there and meet with Lee County again, but it will likely, if we get it, it will be like a scrub restoration or gopher habitat restoration. But we're still meeting with Conservation 2020 and stuff like that. But it's kind of an exciting project.
That's neat.
Yeah, a lot of these engineers or these project managers just really drop the ball when it comes to the plant selection. So they weren't happy with the plant selections, and since we have a relationship with them, they said, hey, why don't you do it instead? So I'm still not convinced it's going to happen because it's like a $50,000 job.
Oh, wow.
Which I can't even say with a straight face. It's actually a $90,000 job, but we'd have to pay them to plant it. So it's a little ridiculous that they only wanted 2 species of plants in the wetland area, and then they were going to grass out all the uplands. So it was a pretty pathetic job that they weren't pleased with. So
Well, yeah, if you're spending that kind of money, they can only come up with 2 plants. That's
yeah,
pathetic.
yeah.
Marlene, was this replanting after some engineering for the marsh or something?
Yeah, they're going to dig out the whole marsh and build the filter marsh, pull it in off Powell Creek, and build the marsh, and then build like a 14-foot berm all around it with I think, a multi-purpose trail on the top of it.
Mm.
But the slopes, they just wanted to grass out, which is, I know, which was their reaction too. But they're like, well, we don't have any money. And so we've provided our insurance, and they don't want us in with their project and stuff, of course, but they give all these excuses. Well, they don't have insurance, and we're like, well, we do have insurance, and so they're kicking back a little bit, but I think Lee County's pushing pretty hard. And then this adjacent property is really overgrown, and there's basically no food for these gopher tortoises. So we'll go up there tomorrow and meet with them and try to restore that habitat. But it really needs to be burned or some type of burn mimic. So that's kind of where we're going.
Did they make the slopes at a reasonable angle?
Well, they haven't made them yet at all. It's still sort of at the planning stages. It's grant money too, but they got a little bit of a reprieve because of COVID. So we're into next year for the finish, for the planting part of it. So I would expect the heavy equipment to go in there sometime soon, but I can find out all that, but it's a little delayed. It's a neat project though. I think it's going to be a really cool project to be involved in. It's just one of those things. It's kind of like when you and I went to Babcock, and it was like, well, this is really cool, but there are a million ways it can fail. Yeah. And Babcock seems to be doing pretty well too, but it's a constant battle with homeowners
Right.
to explain about the native plants.
Right. Or there's a million ways we can make this better too.
Yes, that's probably a better way of putting it. Anyway, so we can get started. We have a few people online. We're going to do a vote after the meeting on the officers. So if you would stick around after Jenny's talk and after the Q&A session, we just want to get a quick vote on our officers for the next year. In the meantime, I'm super excited to talk about our speaker tonight, Jenny Evans. Jenny grew up in the foothills and farmlands of Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. Carrying that fondness forward, she earned a BS in biology with a double major in theater from Mary Washington College and a graduate degree in public garden management from Cornell University. As the Native Landscapes and Adult Education Director at SCCF, she's had an opportunity to blend many of her passions, including conservation, horticulture, and education. Prior to joining SCCF in 2005, Jenny had experience in a variety of nonprofits, ranging from botanical gardens in Washington State and Washington, D.C., as well as environmental education organizations in Florida and the Bahamas. Jenny also serves as president-elect of the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, which we know as FAN, and is a member of the Coccoloba chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society, and serves on the Lee County Roadway Landscape Advisory Committee and the Lee County Extension Services Horticultural Advisory Board. In her spare time, she enjoys traveling and seeing live music with her husband and her son Cassidy. So tonight we have Jenny talking about, will the real native plant please stand up?
Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming. Thanks, Marlene. I guess I should also put an addendum onto that little bio that we're not doing much of the live music these days because of COVID. So instead, we're hanging out on Zoom. So at any rate, there's kind of a small group of us, and I tend to do kind of back and forth in our presentations. I tend to present somewhat informally. So if you guys, want to talk or have questions as we go, please feel free to just speak up. I prefer that. So even though Zoom is kind of funny, unmute yourself, and maybe not all the time, but unmute yourself if you're going to talk and spit out a question. So I thought we talk about, will the real native please stand up tonight? It's kind of a comparison between our natives and some look-alike non-natives, some of which are invasives and some of which are not. But as we go through, we'll take a look at how to distinguish between those species. So first, Marlene mentioned that I am from SCCF. I thought, in case you're not familiar with us, I'd give you a quick overview of what we do. SCCF stands for the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, and we're going into our 54th year, I believe it is. And funny enough, just last year at the beginning of COVID, the Sanibel Sea School, which is another organization, or had been another organization on Sanibel, Sanibel Sea School became part of the SCCF family. And so some of what they do, of course, is environmental education focused on the natural world, but primarily on the ocean. So they take kids of all ages out into the ocean to check out what's there and learn about our natural areas. SCCF as an organization, though prior to Sea School, like I said, we've been around for about 54 years, and we have about 1,800 acres that we manage on Sanibel, Captiva, and even into the Pine Island areas. And our wildlife habitat management department does things like prescribe burns that you can see on the bottom right here. They also have wildlife monitoring and keep all of our lands in good health. So they do a lot of invasive removal and restoration. We also have a coastal wildlife department that keeps track of our sea turtles on the islands. They do research and monitoring during all of sea turtle season for all of Sanibel and Captiva. We also have an ongoing shorebird program that does the same thing. And then we have a research marine laboratory. They do a lot of water quality research, some seagrass restoration and oyster research. Up here on the top right, they maintain a network of water quality sensors that we call Recon. So if anybody happens to be a fisherman or wants to get up-to-date information about what's actually happening in the water, in terms of whether it's temperature or salinity or basic things like that, you can go to the Recon website and get that information in real time. We also do a lot of policy work with using the research that's generated from our coastal wildlife and our marine laboratory departments. And they help try to inform good environmental legislation at the local, regional, and statewide level. And then, of course, the part that I'm most involved in is our Native Landscapes and Garden Center. We really are kind of at the in-between, between what I call the education and the wildlife habitat management departments, in the sense that we try to talk to folks like you or whomever it is that walks through our doors about the things that they can do in their own backyard to create good wildlife habitat. All the things that you're trying to do as part of being a part of the Native Plant Society, we're trying to talk to our local residents about how to do that. So we're located at the Bailey Homestead Preserve. If you ever make it over to Sanibel, which I have to say I would not recommend this week, it's kind of insanity. But when it gets a little calmer, feel free to come over and visit us. We're right on Periwinkle Way, almost directly across from the intersection of Donax. Currently, because of COVID, we have somewhat limited hours, Monday to Thursday, 10 to 3. But it's a beautiful place to walk around and check out what's on the property, as well as potentially purchase some native plants. Okay, so getting into the meat of what we're going to talk about tonight. This is the part where you guys are welcome to speak up. Which is the native? Anybody have any ideas?
On the left.
On the left. And some of these are going to be really easy for you guys because you know your plants pretty well. Okay, so definitely the one on the left is Dahoon holly. As I was putting this together, I realized I should have put the red line probably around the bad things. But this is just a quick comparison of Dahoon holly versus Brazilian pepper. In case you are unsure when you're out in the field, Brazilian pepper has a compound leaf. So it will have multiple leaflets on one leaf. You can see here with the red pointer. Dahoon holly is a single leafed plant. The most distinctive way to tell them apart, of course, would be by the berries. And Dahoon holly has much bigger, typically brighter red berries. They're kind of fleshy. They're either in singles or sometimes they will be, there will be several in a clump together, and they're usually all closely along the branch. Brazilian pepper, on the other hand, has these huge, huge groups of berries. There could be, I don't know, 100 or more in each little clump. The other thing that will let you know that you've got Brazilian pepper versus something else is if you crush the leaves, which do carefully because it is in the same family as poison ivy. But if you crush the leaves in Brazilian pepper, you get a distinctive peppery smell. It will smell nothing like anything else other than, you know, you'll get a very pungent odor. So that's a really good way to identify it. So as we all know, what's the problem with Brazilian pepper? And as we go through this, I might sound a little bit like a broken record, but you'll get the idea. So as we know, the problem with invasive plants is that they outcompete all of our natives. This is actually a picture from my house. When I moved into my house, there was a vacant lot behind us that was completely full of Brazilian pepper. It's now been replaced by a house, so I'm not sure. Although I have planted enough stuff, you can't see it at all. But the berries are loved by birds, and so you will have Brazilian pepper coming up. And this is, I think, the biggest problem with Brazilian pepper in a residential situation. In that you will have Brazilian pepper that's, you may not have any on your yard, but all of a sudden in a year you look around and you say, oh my gosh, what are those red berries? There's a Brazilian pepper that's 10 feet tall. Where did that come from? Most likely it's in some neighboring property and the birds brought it to you. So a couple of recommendations, even if you don't have Brazilian pepper on your property currently, is to scout regularly for it. It is sometimes one of those, as I mentioned, plants that will masquerade until it's 10 feet tall and it has berries. And right around Christmas time is a great time to look for the berries. But scout your property regularly for it because it will sneak up on you, especially in buffer areas. So like at your property lines where you intersect with your neighbors, where there's lots of bushes. The other thing, of course, is, as we all know, fill the voids with natives, of course. The best thing to do is fill the void with something dense, because even if you have birds dropping seeds, perhaps, this is not always the case, but perhaps those seeds will not be able to germinate if there's not enough room for them to germinate. Of course, with that said, if you have trees hanging out on the top, you know, cabbage palms where the birds can sit, you may still have Brazilian pepper coming up through it, unfortunately. Okay, how about this one? Which do you think is a native? If you don't know, just guess.
The one on the left.
The one on the left, do you think is the native? Any other votes otherwise?
It looks a lot like my tree.
And Paula, you are exactly right. The one on the left
Yes.
is wild tamarind. The one on the right is lead tree. A good rule of thumb for this is if you're generally in this area and you are particularly in a natural area, you generally are not going to find wild tamarind. Wild tamarind is actually native to the east coast of Florida. And so unless it's been planted, you most likely will not see wild tamarind. However, if you're unsure, there's some really easy ways to tell. The first one, and this is a little hard to see in these photos, but if you look at the little leaflets that are on these plants, wild tamarinds are at the very tip of those leaflets, pretty much rounded. Now, if you find something that you think is lead tree and you look at these little leaflets, they have a tiny little point right on the end of them. And that's a really good way to distinguish. Now, if you don't have two to compare, sometimes it's a little challenging. And so there are some other ways to tell. One of them is not by the flowers because the flowers look virtually identical. But if you look down here, actually, there you can kind of get a good idea of the points on the leaflets of the lead tree. And same thing for the tamarind, the round leaflets on the ends there. But the best way to tell them apart really is by the seed pods. Wild tamarind and lead tree are both big trees. They both have like a lot of legumes. They both have seed pods that are long and flat. Lead tree holds on to those seed pods almost all year. And the easiest way to identify it is they stay flat and they stay brown. They stay that bronzy brown color, and they will be on the tree, like I said, almost all year. By contrast, wild tamarind, the pods are, and let's see if I can manage to go back here. The pods get kind of flaky brown and white together, and they also have a tendency to twist a little bit. So if you have the seed pods, it's a really easy way to tell. The other thing is if you go somewhere and you see what to me looks like a complete monoculture, this is, I realize, not the best picture, but you get the idea. These are lead trees on a vacant lot that are no more than, I don't know, an inch across, and they're all like 2 feet apart from one another. Wild tamarind will never do that. So if you are somewhere and you just see a bunch of little things clumping that looks like one of the two, you most likely have lead tree. And so, of course, what do? Again, similar to Brazilian pepper, if there is somewhere near you that has lead tree, it's very possible it will show up in your property. If you know there's not a tamarind nearby and you did not plant one and you see that something shows up on your yard that kind of looks like one of the two, you can almost virtually guess that you're going to have lead tree and you probably want to pull it out. Of course, then you can replant with some of our lovely natives. I know I'm speaking to the choir, but I put these in here because I like to mention natives that I think are fun and good replacements. So of course, on the left here, paradise tree is a lovely shade tree. And on the right, pigeon plum is a slightly slower growing, but also equally lovely tree that would be a good replacement. All right. I bet you guys know this one. Which one is the native?
On the right.
Right. Perfect. All right. That one's pretty easy. But how do we know that that one is pretty easy? Of course, we've got a lot of different morning glory species around here, and a lot of them have heart-shaped leaves. But we also have air potato. At this time of the year, you probably would not see this leaf. Air potato is something that goes dormant in winter, and so you most likely will not have this leaf, and if you have this in your yard. But the way to identify it if you do have leaves is, of course, the veins. So they follow the edges of the leaf. They follow this kind of heart-shaped pattern. Versus, of course, morning glory, which is more like a typical leaf venation pattern. There's one main vein and then it branches off from the center. So that's the easiest way to tell. If you see this kind of pillowy, kind of odd venation, heart-shaped leaf, you probably have air potato. If you're not sure, what you want to do is look for, of course, the potato. Now, potatoes can be anywhere from the size of your pinky fingernail or smaller, all the way up to giant, like the size of your head, depending, of course, on how long it's been growing. And of course, if you have a really bad infestation of it, you might see something like the picture on the left. And I've worked with a lot of people that have a decent amount of air potato on their property, and they just say, I cannot deal with all of that. It's just impossible. How do I get rid of this air potato? If nothing else, if you have a lot of air potato on your property and you are a year-round resident, which, by the way, how many, I can't see all of you because I'm sharing my screen, but are there any of you that are seasonal residents? Just say yeah, if you are. Okay, sounds like everybody's year-round, at least from what I've heard.
I think there might be 1 or 2 seasonals.
Okay, all right. Depending on when you're seasonal, if you have air potato and you are only here in the winter, do the best you can to pick up as many potatoes as you can find. if you happen to be a year-round person, or if you happen to be here when there's leaves and you just have too much to deal with, the best thing you can do is actually go along and cut your air potato at the base, because if nothing else, what you're trying to do is prevent it from growing new potatoes. So just go along and clip the bottoms, and then try to it will be a very slow process, but try to get a hold of it that way.
Jenny, are these on the invasive list?
Yeah, air potato. So we typically refer to things by what I call the FLEPSI list, the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. And they categorize invasives as a category 1 or a category 2. Category 1 are the worst things like Brazilian pepper and melaleuca. Air potato is a category 1. Category 2, lead tree is a category 1, I believe. Category 2 are things that are not, they're watching, but they haven't totally wreaked havoc with natural areas. So trying to think of a good example of a category 2. Oyster plant might be a category 1. If anybody knows a category 2 off the top of your head, speak
I
up.
think the coconut
Kalanchoe?
palm.
Is
Is-
Kalanchoe?
Kalanchoe is, I believe, a category 2. Yeah, and coconut, I think they may have put coconut on category 1, honestly, which is a different conversation to have.
And I think Richardia was on category 2 instead of 1. I kind of look at category 2s as they just haven't made it to 1s yet.
Yeah, they definitely are showing potential. That's why they're on category 2 for sure. And the thing that is interesting about the FLEPSI list, interesting and not interesting, I guess, it's formed by, that list is by a bunch of plant experts, but they're throughout the whole state. And when you look at the list, it's categorized into north, central, and south, but it doesn't differentiate between southeast and southwest. And so there are some things on the list that I consider more of a problem in the southeast. One good one is, I think a good example is maybe Sapodilla leaf that's listed as a category 1. I haven't, it does reproduce, but it's not taking over a whole forest. So for our purposes in Southwest, I wouldn't necessarily put that at the top of my list of things to remove from your property. On another hand, actually, you know what? I think Wedelia might be a category 2. And we have serious problems with Wedelia out on Sanibel. So
How about the staghorn fern? Have you had problems with that in this Southwest Florida?
I've seen it reproduce on its own, only in limited areas, but it's not on any invasive list that I'm aware of. But I have seen it reproduce on its own.
It got added to FLEPSI.
Did
in
it?
2019.
Yeah, it's on the 2 list.
Oh man, that's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't get that.
Well, the one place I've actually seen it reproducing on its own, I wonder where else it's doing it, is Rayanne Wessel, who used to be our policy staff member. She recently retired. Many of you probably know her. She lives in North Fort Myers, and she lives on a property that she bought from a person who is a plant, I think a bromeliad enthusiast. And she has a lot of mature live oaks on her property, and there is staghorn fern showing up in random places in her live oaks. Anyway. All right, so moving on. What do you do about air potato? Well, you pick up as many potatoes as you can, as I mentioned. You cut it where you can. And of course, replace with native vines, which again, I just wanted to show you some nice native vines, because you really are never going to have either coral honeysuckle or jackmantia take over your forest like air potato would. All right, how about this one? Anybody know which the native is, or have an idea of which the native is?
Right.
Right. Correct. So when in doubt, pick the better behaved of the two. These are pictures of our native cassias, which are 2 species, Bahama and privet cassia on the left. I switched to the order of the pictures, by the way, in this one. So our native is on the left here, Bahama and privet cassia. And then climbing cassia is our invasive on the right-hand side. This is actually, it's a little hard to tell what it's doing, but it's climbing up a cabbage palm. It's literally like in the top of a cabbage palm in this picture. And the climbing cassia is an interesting one because we have a decent amount of it on Sanibel, and when it blooms, people get really excited about it because it is quite pretty. The flowers of both climbing cassia and Bahama and privet cassia look virtually identical. If all you're looking at is flowers, you're never going to be able to tell them apart. But the easiest way is these also have compound leaves, and on our two native shrubs, which by the way, they are both shrubs. The picture that was previous is Bahama cassia, which typically stays a little bit lower and a little bit wider. Privet cassia will get a little taller and stays a little narrower, but they both are never, privet cassia is probably never over 8 feet, let's say. And the leaflets on the plants have a point. Contrast that with climbing cassia, which also has compound leaves, but those leaflets, you can see in a couple of places here, are totally rounded. That is the easiest way to differentiate the two. Now, if you happen to see seed pods on the two, it's another easy way, but you're not always going to see this. Bahama and privet cassia have seed pods that are flat. You can see a little bit of it in side profile here, but climbing cassia has seed pods that look basically like green beans. They're totally rounded. You won't miss them if they're there. They will turn brown when they're mature, but they will still be completely cylindrical. The habit is, of course, different too. Climbing cassia, it will climb up things, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Sometimes it will be growing like a mounding shrub. So it will stay shrub-like if it doesn't have anything to climb on. And then, of course, what's the problem? Well, like everything else, it outcompetes our natives. It also, being in the legume family, produces, similar to lead tree and wild tamarind, but on the invasive side, it produces tons of seeds, and those seeds will germinate very readily. We've got an area at the Bailey Homestead that had a lot of climbing cassia. We have a trail crew that will go through and remove invasives for us periodically, but they're seasonal. And they went through and removed every single climbing cassia that they could find in this area about 2 years ago. They missed last year because of COVID, and almost all of it is back again. So similar to the air potato, if you have this and you can't do anything else, go through and try to remove the seed pods and throw them in the garbage, because then at least you're preventing this spread. But the one downside is if you have, like a lot of our invasives, if you have any kind of soil disturbance and there is seed in that soil, it's going to germinate, because of course a lot of our invasives are really good at taking the place when there's disturbance. So of course, pull all seedlings. You can also remove the seed pods and then replace with native vines and shrubs. I like these two because they kind of grow in a similar way to climbing cassia. Snowberry on the right, if it has something to climb or clamber on, it will. And then if you have a wet area, of course, climbing aster is a really, really beautiful one as well. All right, how about this? Which one do you think is the native?
On the right.
On the right. Tony knows this because he's on the beach a lot. So these are our inkberries. The one on the left is the non-native. The one on the right is our native. And these are actually, once you get used to telling these apart, they're actually pretty easy. If there are berries, there's no mistaking. The non-native inkberry, of course, has white berries. The native inkberry has black berries. So that's a very easy cut and dried characteristic. The other way to tell if there's not berries is just feel the leaves. If you feel the invasive one, they're floppy, they're a little bit fuzzy, and they're typically a lot bigger. If you feel the native one, they do not have any hair, they're kind of waxy, they're kind of succulent almost, and they're typically a little bit smaller. Now, if you see them on the beach, this picture is just to make you confused. If you see them on the beach, there's a definite difference in the way that they grow as well. Our native, which is the one over here on the right, is typically mounding. It doesn't usually get more than about 3-4 feet. It will form a clump, but not terribly big. The one on the left, which I always have to include because I actually took this picture locally. This is our invasive, and this sign was so carefully placed in front of the invasive one, which I find highly ironic. But anyway, the non-native inkberry it will create a huge monoculture, and it gets quite tall. It can easily be 6, maybe even 8 feet in the right conditions. The real challenge for this particular plant, as I mentioned, is it makes monoculture, but if you go to remove this plant, it will come up by any little sprout that's left in the ground. The other thing that's unfortunate are that, and this is the way that it travels around, is that the seeds float. So that's how it's problematic on our beaches, of course. And so what do? Remove them completely, monitor for new sprouts. If you're removing it in a beach area, sometimes what you have to do is remove it all. You either have to poison the stumps, which is not great, of course, in a beach situation, or you have to let it sit and watch for any new little parts that you missed to come up and then pull those out. Of course, watch for any seedlings coming up, and then, like everything else, replace with natives.
Jenny, when they, in preserves, is there a policy when they're cleaning out all these non-natives for them to replace anything? I usually see them take out but not put anything in.
It depends on what you're talking about or where you're talking about. Are you referring to anywhere in specifically?
Well, the smaller preserves in HOAs that are government monitored.
Yeah, so I can't totally speak to that because it really depends on who the agency is that's requiring the invasive removal. I mean, I can tell you as an organization, this is totally different than what you would see in a public property sometimes. If we are going to remove invasives and we're doing a restoration, we typically have a replanting plan, but we are private. As I think probably Marlene can speak to, typically Conservation 2020, which is county, if they are doing a restoration, they typically have a replanting plan. Now there's a difference between having a restoration on a big piece of property and removing an invasive here and there, if that makes any sense. If you're just removing an invasive here and there, you're not going to replant probably because you probably already have a bunch of good things around it.
Except that there's the Brazilian pepper is about 20 feet wide.
Yeah, and it depends on where it is. You know, part of it is probably funding, because there's no way in the world that every time Brazilian pepper gets yanked out in a, let's say, a relatively small, like less than a half an acre size, there's probably not funding to replant after that. But usually agencies, if it's a big project, they usually have a replanting requirement. Not always, but for instance, that that area that I was talking about with the climbing cassia on our own property, that was something that we were required to do because of some other things from the water management district, and they did require that we replant it. It was, so we had to remove all of the invasives in the area, and we also had to replant it. The challenge is keeping up with it. So I don't have a good answer for you on that, but my guess is that if it's like a spotty thing here and there, it's really a funding and time question. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think sometimes it might have to do with the community, the plant community. In wetlands, I think the seed bank is still in there a lot. So a lot of times you can get away with not replanting in a wetland as long as you manage to remove the invasive exotics that are coming in.
Yeah, it just depends. I mean, the tricky thing with invasive removal is that it's really expensive, and it requires a lot of follow-up if it's going to be done well. Sometimes that's not necessarily put into the planning process. So. Okay, so how about this one? Which do you guys think is the native? Getting a little trickier as we go.
The left.
Left.
Left. All right, you guys are doing well. So the left one, of course, is our native blue porterweed. The right one is our non-native blue porterweed. Just to make things complicated, they have the same common name, mainly because they're the same genus. The way to tell them apart, and this is going to get a little more muddied here in a second, but the general way to tell them apart is our native has a lighter purple flower versus our non-native blue porterweed is more dark purple. Now, The non-native porterweeds, there's a whole bunch of different ones and they come in all sorts of different colors. There's like dark purple and I've seen white. There's kind of like a coral color. So they come in all sorts of colors. But if you get a lavender one, often, not always, but often that is our native. The other way, I'll go back to this picture, is of course their growth habit. Our native grows low to the ground, almost never going very high, and it goes out more than it does up, versus the non-native, which is going almost primarily up. Our native will never, this is like 3 or 4 feet tall. It will never get that tall. Now, to complicate factors, they hybridize. So sometimes if you are buying a plant and you are not sure what it's doing and you're not sure the flower colors, these flower colors, not really dark purple, it's not really light purple. And this plant's kind of going sort of up, but sort of out, but not as high as the non-native usually. You very well might have a hybrid. And in full disclosure, we have gotten hybrids in the nursery before unknowingly. It just happens. It's one of these things, if you have non-native on your property, lots of people do because they're great for butterflies, but you also introduce the native. If you have seedlings coming up, you very well could end up with hybrids that are the seedlings. So my typical recommendation is if you are trying to go all native, which I would recommend from a genetic standpoint, because our native populations of blue porterweed are getting inundated with kind of genetic muddying from the non-native. But if you are trying to go all native, pull all of the things that you're not sure about out of your yard, and then only plant the native, and then very carefully watch the seedlings that come up. Of course, all of the porterweeds have great wildlife value from a butterfly and insect standpoint. But if you're hesitant to pull out the non-native because you like that height, try to find something that's got a similar form. Starry rosinweed is a really great example. It's a true perennial and it goes up. It's great for our insects and has a very, very similar growth form to the non-native porterweed. Okay, how about this one?
The left.
The left is the native, you think?
Yeah.
And you are right. So this is another tricky one in that, previous to this, I've been kind of talking about what I would call more black and white, with maybe the exception of porterweed. It's native or it's invasive. What we've got now is our native firebush, which typically has these very red tubular flowers with what's commonly called dwarf firebush. It can also be called African firebush. I've also seen it sold under various cultivar names. It typically has an orangey, it will still have some red in it, but an orangey to yellowish flower. The easiest way to tell these apart is that our native will usually have, you have to look very closely, but on the underside along the vein, there will be tiny, tiny, tiny little hairs. And the whole thing is bigger, it's a duller color in terms of the leaves. On dwarf firebush, if you look at the leaves, there are absolutely no hairs on it whatsoever. The leaves themselves are usually smaller, but not always. And it's usually got kind of a glossy appearance as a whole. Now, the trouble with this is not so much that this one is considered invasive, though if you've ever tried to remove dwarf firebush, it is a complete nightmare. It will, if you cut it down, it will come up from the roots forever, basically. One of my staff members has been trying to kill a dwarf firebush literally for like 5 years. But it's not invading our natural areas. But what is happening with it is, here's our friends, of course, from All Native. This is a dwarf firebush that's obviously not dwarf. So it's just being put in inappropriate places. Our native firebush is actually, as you probably all know, kind of a small tree. You can trim it into a shrub, but what I've found that happens over time is it really keeps trying to grow into sort of a small tree. And eventually it'll get really woody and it'll start to thin out at the bottom. So I actually think our native is more appropriately used and allowed to thin out as it gets older and underplant. So used as a small tree. Now, the funny thing that's going on from a from an ecological standpoint is there is another firebush that has been brought in from the Caribbean called Hemilia cuprea. That's this plant right here. It's got a very different flower, and you would have to really search this out. It's not very readily available in the nursery industry. But what it's doing is that it is starting to hybridize with Hemilia patens. Now, it's a little bit unclear as to what exactly is going on because, of course, these two firebush are not only like cousins because they're both Hemilia patens, they're separate botanical varieties. So they're even more closely related, which makes it even more concerning that this hybridization is going on because the more closely related something is, the more likely it is to hybridize. So it hasn't been happening a ton, but it is definitely cause for concern that our native populations of firebush could be having some hybridization in the wild potentially. And of course, you can replace it with an appropriately sized native shrub. Bahama coffee is one of my favorites if you happen to be in a shady area. Or this is a locust berry, one of the varieties that stay a little bit denser. There's kind of two, variety is not the right term, but there's kind of two different forms of locust berry. One is tree-like and one is shrub-like, and shrub-like one is a lot more compact. Another one that I don't have a picture of is maiden bush. That's a really great shrub that stays kind of smallish and compact. And then we get to these. This is a fun topic. Who has an idea of which one's the native one?
One on the right.
The one on the right. Yeah, this is these are the lantanas. The one on the right is pretty easy to distinguish from our invasive lantana. This is wild sage, which is Lantana involucrata. It's if you haven't seen it, it's a small to medium sized shrub. Gets quite woody, but it still is a great insect attractant, like all the lantanas. It gets a completely white flower. And then you can see back here in the background, it's followed by a cluster of purple berries, which are quite nice. Conversely, the invasive lantana comes in all sorts of colors. It can be a shrub, it can be a ground cover, it grows, and it's been cultivated a ton, so it's got a lot of different growth forms. The leaves on this, you can't see the very end, but the leaves on our invasive are typically pointed. Here's another example of the growth forms. This is, of course, our wild sage, our native, and then this is kind of a sprawling non-native or invasive. Now, where this gets really complicated, let me back up, actually. As I mentioned, this has been cultivated a whole bunch. So there's a whole bunch of different flower colors. So just looking at the flower color is not going to be able to give you enough information to distinguish what you've got. And the reason for that is because we have a couple other natives that are commonly called pineland lantana or lantana depressa. There's a couple different varieties. One of them is a local variety. It was called variety sanabelensis. And it occurred on Sanibel into Cayo Costa, North Captiva, and kind of the barrier islands. It probably went south some as well. There's one from the Miami-Dade area that occurs in prime rocklands. And then there's one other variety that I don't actually know much about. But all of them are yellow. All of them are low growing. And what has happened is that the non-native has totally hybridized with particularly the pineland lantanas, so much so that if you go out looking for one, like I've looked for our native one, the variety sanabelensis, for years, and they're pretty much gone. They've been totally taken over by the non-native one. Now, with that said, there are a few circulating in horticultural production that are the true pineland lantana, but there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, frauds out there. So that's a tricky one. That's a really tricky plant to figure out. Okay, and you guys have kind of already seen this because I keep forwarding to this slide.
I had one more question about the pineland lantana.
Sure.
I understood that the paler yellow one is the native one and the brighter yellow one is the non-native, or is that not a way to tell at all?
It's kind of a way to tell.
Okay.
Yes, that is true. However, it depends on how purist you want to be, honestly. This is kind of where the know your source comes into play. for instance, the one that I know to be the true Pineland lantana comes from a nursery over in Homestead called Silent Native. Marlene gets a lot of plants at Cutting Horse from there. They're very reputable. They can tell you exactly where all of their plants came from. I think many of you probably know Steve Woodmansey. He's been pretty active in the Native Plant Society. He's a really great botanist, and he works partially there as well. And he verified the ones that came from Silent Native, which do have a pale yellow color. With all of that said, there are some that have circulated around with a paler yellow color that if you were to put them in a genetics test, probably come out closer to the invasive than to the native. So it's not a cut and dry thing. It's a, let's do the best we can and know who you're getting your plants from and ask questions. I think that's the best way.
Thank you.
And even, Jenny, even those Silent Native ones, they, according to Bruce Turley, they are only 95% native
Yeah,
because that's as close as we can get.
that's as good as it gets these days. That's how much they've hybridized in the wild. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know anything about that percentage. Did they have some like genetics work done? Maybe.
I don't know. That's just what he told me, that, you know, these have been blessed by those in the know.
Yeah. Yeah.
As close to native as we're ever going to get.
It's as close as it exists, unless
Yeah.
somebody finds somewhere some magic population. But you know, insects fly around. So even if there's some magic population that was hidden that no person has ever found before, the insects have probably found it and cross-pollinated.
Right.
So the other thing that's really tricky, Paula, just to get into the weeds of this, is that unless there's a lot of funding to do this very nitpicky work, we're never going to know. The only way that you would ever know the answer really truly is to genetic test like every batch, not every batch that you produce, but genetic test, you know, the different sources of plants and see what you come up with. And that's just virtually impractical, honestly.
Okay, I'm just worried. I just put 2 in. So
Well, the best I can tell you is don't be too worried. This is not, it's one of those situations where you do the best that you can, and you can only do the best that you can with the information you're given. And know that in this particular situation, you're not hurting anything. Really, truly, the damage in this particular plant
it's done.
was done a long time ago. And you know, even if you are planting something that's called Pineland lantana, and maybe it's not all the way Pineland lantana, it's definitely not worse than all of the definite non-native lantana that's just being sold everywhere. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, don't beat yourself up over it. You know, you get into these various shades of gray where you could, you know, make yourself crazy trying to figure it out. And we all want to do the best that we can, but you know, don't feel like you're a bad person if you end up with the wrong lantana or something.
I can say I tried.
Yeah. And you know, we do this all the time, and we are constantly sort of reinventing what we know. When I started 15 years ago, we sold dwarf firebush because it was widely considered a native. And then more information came out and everybody realized it wasn't. So we stopped doing it, you know, and it's been like that for years. There's just this constant kind of you know, just getting better at what you do. So.
Okay, thank you.
This is actually a similar subject, this particular plant. Anybody have ideas on which one is, well, I'm putting quotes native. Explain in a second.
Are these pitch apples?
These are pitch apples. Yeah, the picture's from sort of far away, I realize. If it gives you a hint, these leaves on this one are about twice the size of the leaves on this one.
Come on, is somebody going to say the one on the left?
Well, Marlene, you just did. Perfect. All right, so technically the one on the left is our native. And when I say technically, I will explain in a second, but this I only threw in at the end because it's one of these, it's a good example of where you're getting down to really the nitty gritty. As I mentioned before, the leaves on this particular plant on the left are about twice as big. They're about yay big as the leaves of this plant on the right. The leaves of this plant on the right are about this big. Our native pitch apple will grow easily into a tree, like full on kind of small shade tree, assuming that it stays warm enough. If we ever have really cold winters, it does get some cold damage in our area, particularly for you all that are inland a little bit. By contrast, the small leaf pitch apple, it gets almost no cold damage, but this is widely planted as hedges and shrubs and things everywhere. It's the big dense waxy leaf thing. But the reason that you would know the difference would be the small leaf and the big leaf. Now, with all of that said, I will mention that our pitch apple, the nativity has kind of been questioned. It most likely, if it occurred within Florida, it was only in a small section of the Keys, and that's kind of even up for debate. But take that for what you will. And that's actually the end of my plants. I wanted to give you guys some references that you probably already know about. But on the top are two books that I really like. I believe that at least the Osorio book, I think, is out of print. But you can find it probably from some used bookstore if you don't have it. The one caveat is that both of these books, while they're wide ranging and have really great descriptions, they cover the whole state of Florida. So there are things that are in there that are recommended specifically from North Florida, and they do not do well here. For information, of course, I have the Native Plant Society here. Of course, you guys know all about that. The Florida Association of Native Nurseries, or FAN, if you don't know that organization, it's a good place to figure out where to get some of the plants you're looking for. If for some reason you can't get them from us or from the Native Plant Society at Cutting Horse, it will tell you other places to go. The Florida Yards and Neighborhoods program is really great, as well as the Extension Service. If you guys don't know Stephen Brown, he has become more native friendly in his recent years. So he's a great guy to pepper with questions. And then there's a couple of places that I use their websites all the time, literally all the time. The first one is the Atlas of Florida Plants. It's the folks that basically wrote the book about what's native in Florida. And they are constantly updating their website, which is really great. It's based out of the University of South Florida. They will make you crazy if you are one that looks at scientific names. They will make you crazy with scientific name changes, but it's a really great reference for what's native, where it's native to. And then they usually have some pictures, or they have herbarium specimens if you want to reference what a plant looks like. The Institute for Regional Conservation is another really good friend. They're also a nonprofit based out of, I think it's Delray Beach these days. So they're on the East Coast. They also have a great website that's got a lot of different plant profiles. They have a section called Natives for Your Neighborhood. And it's got all kinds of information from growth habits to wildlife interaction to pictures. So that is good, a really great resource. Here's my photo credits. If anybody wants to know where I got a photo, please let me know. And then this is our contact information at the Native Landscapes and Garden Center, our address and our hours. And then if anybody wants to get in touch with me personally or has a question, here's my email and our phone number, and then also our website. So with all of that said, as you guys go along, if you have questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to us. We're there to, to talk to you and help you and figure out how to plant in your yard. The other couple things I wanted to mention, just as a sort of, since I've got your attention, we have a handful of programs coming up. Of course, with COVID, we're doing almost everything virtually. So we've got some stuff that might interest you guys. One thing that came to mind is we have a group of volunteers called the Weeds and Seeds group. And it's typically during non-COVID times, they go on walks once a week during season and look at plants and identify plants. But what they've morphed into during COVID is every 2 weeks, they do a virtual walk. So one of the leaders will be out in the field, literally with their phone, pointing out plants. And there will be another person that's kind of in the studio. And Ruth has usually got a Word document with photos, and they talk about how to identify the plants. And you can look at the pictures really close from her photos. So they've been really popular. The next one coming up is on Monday. If you're interested in doing that, they're free of charge. Just email you and I'll send you the registration link. I think the one on Monday is, ironically, since we just talked about this, focused primarily on invasives. I think they're going to talk about some other things too, but usually they visit a different place around the island and talk about what they see. The other thing coming up is we have what we call our annual Everglades update. It's an evening program next Wednesday. I believe it's at 7 o'clock. And it's a panel of folks that are all involved in Everglades restoration. So our policy person, James Evans, somebody from the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, someone from the Everglades Foundation. I'm not going to get all of these people. There's 2 or 3 other people participating, and they're going to do a panel presentation on the benefits of the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, which is sort of a major construction component of Everglades restoration. So if anyone is interested in attending that, it is also free. It's on Eventbrite, so you could search us under Eventbrite and find it, or you can email me. And then later on in March, we are going to do another evening presentation about swallowtail kites. I don't have the date of that totally worked out yet, and with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to answer questions or not.
I have one question, Jenny, that is how to recognize the male Brazilian pepper.
The male Brazilian pepper. I actually wasn't aware that there was male and female.
Yeah. And is this the smell maybe is with the crush the.
Yeah, so if there's no berries, so let's say there's no berries, the smell is a good way to do it. The other thing, and I'm not going to be able to bring it up right now, but the leaflets, they're what are called oddly pinnate. So there is almost always a leaflet at the end of the full leaf. So that's one way. And usually the very bottom of the stem is kind of reddish. So we'll have a reddish tinge. Once you start, look up pictures, like if you just Google Brazilian pepper leaves or something like that, start looking at the way the leaves are arranged. There isn't much that looks exactly like that. But between the smell, it usually grows like a bramble if you have a big one. When it's in full bloom, the bees love it. So you do have a definitive, it's kind of a weird smell to the flowers. Anybody else have any good ID characteristics? There's no fruit.
I think the more you look at it, the more it just stands out. I think that serrated leaves, the leaf edges, the leaf margins are very serrated. And the color, of course, or I'm sorry, the aroma.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is if you come across somewhere where you find what you think is it and you're not sure, take a picture and send it to us. We'll tell you. That would be the other definitive way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Doug Cooper has a question. It says, "Hi, Jenny. How about Brazilian pepper tree thrips? Are biological controls like this promising? Thrips in Lee County." I don't know if he's asking if we have thrips in Lee County.
Yeah, they are promising with some caveats. I don't know if the thrips have been released in Lee County. I'm not aware of that. And by the way, hi, Doug. What he's referring to, for those of you that don't know, is there's been a variety of different efforts for a variety of different invasive plants to find something that will kill them. There's a beetle that is actively being released for air potato. There's these thrips that are actively being released for Brazilian pepper. I think that they were working on something for Melaleuca. I don't know the current status on that. But there's a couple things to know about it. in general is that the state is typically in charge of this, and they're very careful about making sure that whatever it is they're releasing is not going to be more of a problem than a solution. So it takes them a long time to do all of the testing and try to figure out that it's going to be something that's going to be helpful. Like I think they've been developing this thrips for, not developing, but doing testing on whether the thrips are helpful or not for like 10 years or more, a long time. And the thing, what we've seen particularly with the air potato beetle, and I think this is fairly typical, is that it's a slow process. So let's say you release 100 bugs. It takes however long it takes for these insects to reproduce and build up their population to then start to make a dent in the plant. And the other thing to know is that they're going to have more success in areas where you have almost nothing but Brazilian pepper, where there's a lot of food source. So I don't think it's a relatively, I don't think it's practical to think that, for instance, Brazilian pepper thrips are going to kill the small little Brazilian pepper in your yard. And the reason for that is, from a biological perspective, there's just not enough food there. Those thrips are not going to reproduce in your yard because you don't have much for them to eat, because you don't have much Brazilian pepper. So where they're going to do the good is where you have acres and acres and acres of Brazilian pepper that needs to have something happen. And so they are promising in that sense, but they're not going to be helpful to like one individual plant. Does that answer your question?
Doug says, thanks.
How do you spell the name of the insect? What are you saying?
Thrips, Thrips. Tony, if you open up your chat box, and in the bottom, there's a little thing that looks like a word bubble.
Yeah.
Doug wrote it. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. The beetle, the air potato beetle, they released some on Sanibel a few years ago, and we are starting to see, you'll see an air potato leaf with like, it almost looks like little BBs went through it. That's where the beetle has been chewing on it. And they're doing some damage, but I wouldn't say they're winning the battle. We also, the areas that I've observed it, have been in areas where we don't have huge infestations either. So it's kind of that what I described scenario. So my guess is that where there are lots of air potato leaves, they are doing much better.
Russian State Park. They released them over there, and they're working over there.
Is it actually killing the plant, or is it just keeping it from getting worse?
All I know is there's lots of holes in the leaves, so I don't know, I have to go back and look.
Yeah. Yeah, the one thing I don't know about the air potato beetle is what happens when there's nothing, what happens in the winter? Do the beetles go dormant too? I don't know.
Yeah, they do go dormant. They migrate into the ground, and they go into diapause until spring, when they emerge again and start feeding.
Oh, cool. So it's timed with it's in sync with the air potato plant.
Yes, yes.
Nice.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I would like to compliment Jenny for the work that they've done over there at that property. I've watched it from when it was just bought to the other day visiting and seeing the new bog that's going in, the little I guess the little bridge over the wet area there. But, you guys just keep doing better and better stuff. And it's wonderful to see all of that grown. And it's one of my favorite places to be. And if I'm not at the nursery, I'm back in the little trail in the back. So.
Well, thanks, Paula. We like having you come over too. The trail is never ending. The trail is always, because there's never ending invasives that pop up along the trail. So.
Great. Yeah. And we would encourage everyone to go out to Sanibel, make a day of it or whatever. The nursery is really fantastic. the demonstration gardens have just grown in, and between Jenny and Becca and Emily and Sue, I mean, the knowledge out there doesn't get any better. So Jenny, thanks so much for talking with us tonight. Good to
Yeah.
see you.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Thanks
See
for
you
having me. It was what a month and something, no, a year and a month late, is that right? No.
No, I don't think
forget.
I think it's less than
No,
a year.
less than a year. Sorry, I was supposed to talk to you guys right at the beginning of COVID. My sense of time has done weird things in COVID, but
Yeah, I think it was April or June or something like that. We were supposed to talk, but yeah, thanks. This was a great talk.
sure.
And
Great topic. Thank you so much.
yeah, it
You're
was a lot of
welcome.
fun.
Yeah, and like I said, if you guys end up with a question about what you've got, just take a picture and send it to one of us. It's probably easiest way. So yeah, I will let you guys get to your meeting unless,
Well, you're a member, so you can vote too.
oh, if you want to. Yes, for sure, I will vote.
Anyway, tonight is our annual meeting, and we haven't really been doing formal meetings because of there's only so long you can sit in front of your computer for a Zoom meeting. So we've been trying to minimize that time. But tonight is our annual meeting, and we do have a couple of changes in board positions. And so we want to get a formal vote tonight on the new board positions. All the positions are staying the same, except Tony is expanding his duties in addition to the newsletter to also president. And this was the slate that we're proposing that we can vote on tonight, or if anyone's interested and wants a position, I don't think you're going to get a lot of argument from any of us. So if you'd like to be on the board, we'd love to have you, and invite you to consider being on a board on the board. I'm I'm willing to stay as the vice president. Graham is willing to stay as the treasurer. Christopher Bowman, who's been a great, highly unpaid intern, has agreed to do the secretary duties. Lucy Brightung has agreed to stay on as our Council of Chapters rep. Cassie as our membership chair, and she's also doubles as our FGCU liaison. And Tony Mariello as the newsletter editor, as we mentioned, and Nick Valenti as our communications and events chair, and then Jim Rodwell as our director. So if any nominations or anything like that, questions, comments? If we could go ahead and take a vote, everyone in favor, please say aye.
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 Is there any?
Aye.
Thank you. Is there anyone opposed? Was that a yes? Is that a no? Okay, so we'll assume it was a 12-0 unanimous vote for the board to move forward. Great. And next month, we're still working on that speaker, but please stay tuned to your newsletter, and feel free to give any of us a call or email or anything, and keep in touch and let us know if you have any comments or questions. Anything else for tonight?
Are we discussing any of the new business?
Oh, well, this was sort of our board agenda.
Oh, okay.
But I just pulled it up from that. But
Okay.
did you want to talk about John Sibley or anything like that?
I didn't have anything to say. I mean, I knew, but no, I just didn't know whether we were discussing any of the rest of this. So
No, I think perhaps we'd like to do a very short business meeting in the future at the beginning of the talk. We'd like to get back to Graham doing the
I know.
the treasurer's report.
I missed that.
I know. I don't know. I don't think Graham's still on here tonight. But we'd like to get back to doing a little bit more of that. It's just that balancing act because we are all in front of our computers and it does get a little old after a bit. But we'll plan to do that next month, assuming Graham can attend. And we'll talk a little bit more about our projects. Hopefully we'll have an announcement about this Powell Creek or the Powell Creek filter marsh and things like that. Anything else? Okay, so with that, we can say goodnight for the evening and see you next month.
And Jenny, if you're still on, thank you very much.
Of course,
Good
good
night,
to see you
everybody.
guys.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks for having me. Night.
Great job. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you and good night.
Good
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 night.
night, Anna.